Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hey everyone, please enjoy John and my continuing conversation and reaction to Wesley Huff's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience.
So part of my area of speciality and research is...
You notice how there was a little funny slip there? He almost said my area of expertise, but then realized he couldn't say that because he doesn't have an area of expertise. So then it's his area of research, the thing that he's studying right now.
Yeah.
But, all right, that just goes to my earlier point.
I study paratextual features. We're really going to get nerdy today.
Let's get nerdy.
So you look at the features of the manuscripts, not necessarily the words, but things like the spaces between the words, the development of punctuation, indentation or outdentation. And I look at the margins, and I try to, based on the average size of manuscripts in and around that time, and also the average spacing of words and the margins on the top, bottom, and the side, recreate what the manuscript could have possibly looked like.
Whoa.
I know that they do that, and I've seen some of Wes's videos on that, but doesn't that seem a little bit speculative? He's going to say later on something about being able to... Maybe we'll just wait and talk about it when he says. So I think that's super interesting. But if you're just looking at the average side of margins, it just seems like a lot of it is based on speculation. And even when he talks about it later, I think they use computers, so the person is ultimately manipulating what they're trying to align.
My issue is that, again, we don't have an expert in that field to explain why that's important or why that's not important or what it actually is. We just have this student that's doing it, trying to explain it. And the fact that I know he's a Christian apologist at heart, it's not giving me all that much confidence to just trust what he's saying. So I'm taking everything he's saying with a big grain of salt. It may be a perfectly valid area of research that he's doing. I don't know. But I would prefer to have somebody that actually has a degree in the field to tell me that.
Yeah, that's my issue as well. I would be interested more in exactly how this works. I've followed up with some of Wes's videos. They are very apologetic, so you have to take it with a grain of salt.
How similar is it to the Book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
Joe Rogan just asked a really good question.
Yeah.
So I have to give him credit.
This is probably the most explosive part of the whole interview.
Oh, okay.
Earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not word for word identical with the Masoretic text. This whole part got extremely muddled, and Wes had to correct himself a couple times afterwards. First of all, we're talking about 1Q Isaiah A, which is the Great Isaiah Scroll, the complete Isaiah Scroll.
Right.
And the Masoretic text, again, is sort of misleading because the Masoretic text is a combination of a few different codexes that are used to make up the Masoretic text. There's also Isaiah scroll. I think it's 1Q Isaiah B, which is a second Isaiah scroll that was found in the same cave. And so Wes said that he was thinking of a quote that he had read about that scroll being identical with the Masoretic text, which even that claim is dicey. But here's the big spoiler. None of these texts are identical. That never happened. There are no texts that are identical. They all have variation. I got a copy of the variations in the Isaiah scroll in English between the Masoretics and 1Q Isaiah A. And there were thousands of variations in the Isaiah scroll.
So what is he talking about? Because when he said that, it stood out for me because I said, that's not true.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert, but I know that's not true. And of course, Joe Rogan goes, oh, wow. This shows you his apologetic stripes.
Yeah.
He's not coming in there as an academic to give you facts. He's trying to persuade you that his religious ideology is true. And I just have one question for apologists that use this tactic. First of all, it's deceptive, if not outright lying. But second of all, if there is an all-powerful God, does he want people representing him and promoting him by giving false information? Going on the assumption that there's an all-powerful God that you believe in and that you are trying to endorse and support, why would that God want people to believe him based on things that are not true?
Those are completely fair questions. This was probably the most contentious moment because everybody pounced on it immediately. As I was watching this, I wrote Kip Davis a message on Twitter like, is the Isaiah scroll identical with the Masoretic text? And he's like, no, it's not identical.
I just remember that, I've actually heard skeptics use this as an example of how it's not the same.
There are books from the Dead Sea Scrolls that are like very different from what we have in other places. I think Proverbs has extra chapters.
No, and Isaiah has a lot of striking similarities, there's no doubt. So that's what he's using as his strongest case. But the Great Isaiah Scroll is between 5 and 10% longer than the standard Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text. So it's like, how can he say it's word for word identical when it's actually 5 to 10% longer in length?
Yeah, and it has verses that are just missing. In all fairness, I think that this whole line of argument for apologists really needs to just be retired because there are no copies that are the same. So making some sort of a claim of accuracies of copies as if that proves something, like we have this level of consistency, so therefore that shows some sort of, I think the implication is there's some sort of divine hand that's preserving the message of the text.
Absolutely, that's the implication. Definitely.
It's a miracle that this text is preserved so well. The fact is, no, there were some pretty good scribes when it came to copying the Qumran documents.
Oh, absolutely. It was a profession.
I think they said it's 97% identical once you account for the markings, which is really good. There are ways that you can make some sort of claims and judgments about the accuracy of the versions of the text that you have by the number of variations. Right. But what you can't do is make some sort of divine claim. If God was going to copy the text, he would get the copy right.
Right.
I don't understand this claim.
There's no evidence to it that stands out as being supernatural.
No.
There is evidence that, oh, wow, like the Jewish profession of being a scribe was something that they took very seriously and did a very good job of. That's great. But that's as far as it goes. That's why with the New Testament, you can't make that claim because the variants are all over the place. And he's not making the case with the New Testament. Again, you cherry pick out what you think your strongest argument is. You conveniently leave out all the inaccuracies because it doesn't support your case. Again, that shows that he has an agenda here. Agree with it or not, there's a very clear agenda with what he's doing. I was interested to hear, Ben, you said that there was a big reaction. That's good. Were there a lot of people saying, wait a second, this is not true?
Yeah, so There's literally verses where you'll have the first half of the verse in the Masoretic text, and then the second half is missing in the Isaiah scroll. So part of the problem is there were apologists and people going back and forth with statistics. So like Dan McClellan did a video and he said, well, it's 92% accurate. And then somebody said, well, it's more like 95% accurate. They came back at him. There was apologists and scholars going back and forth. It really did create a lot of dialogue. Myth Vision did a thing about it. Gnostic Informant did a video about it. Wes had to come back and make some corrections and explanations in what he was trying to say. He made the clarification. He wasn't talking about the Isaiah 1 scroll. He was talking about a quote that he remembered. I mean, again, it was sort of an obfuscation, though, because what Wes said was, well, this is a paraphrase, so forgive me. I don't want to leave myself open for libel. But basically he said, well, I was thinking about a quote that I had read from a scholar the other day that was talking about the second Isaiah scroll. And it was saying, like, basically it was almost word for word with the Masoretic text. So he kind of like flubbed that quote to make it a little bit stronger than it was, and he misapplied it. But then Wes said in his clarification, but I'm talking with some scholars that I know now, and I'm pretty confident that I can make the same claim for Isaiah A.
Right.
Then they did an episode where they explained some of the textual features that happened in the Isaiah scroll. So, for example, where that verse is missing is actually at the bottom of a row of text where you have missing pieces, but they're all spaced at the bottom of the text. So what the scholar that Wes had on was saying that what most likely happened is the person who was copying that text was copying from a damaged text that didn't have those bottom verses. And so they may have reconstructed some of them, and some of them they didn't have any text to reconstruct. And I think, like, okay, that makes sense. But that doesn't mean it's not a variation. Because if you only had the Isaiah scroll and you didn't have the Masoretic text, you would think that's the text. Like, you wouldn't know that, oh, there's this other text that got left out. So that's what I mean. Like, you don't have documents that are the same. You don't have a text here that's the same as the text over there. All you have is imperfect copies. So this whole thing about copies proving something, I don't think copies prove anything. All they prove is that you may have a more accurate copy or a less accurate copy. Not that there's some sort of sovereign plan going on in preserving the text.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite understand the argument either because, okay, what is the argument? Is the argument that we know the text was written at some point. So it's not like, oh, this proves that it existed. We knew it existed at that point. I guess the argument is that it was preserved perfectly, therefore there is a supernatural event happening here. But I always say this with that. It's like, so you're saying God is 95% preserving his word? I don't quite get that. Honestly, the Islamic tradition makes more sense because they're saying, well, it's God, so it's perfect. What we have is perfect. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I haven't studied it. I have studied the Bible, and I know that it's not perfect. And if you take Isaiah, it's 95%. And that's the one they like to go to because that they think is their strongest argument. If you went to Jeremiah, you would have a much bigger problem. So again, what's the argument here? They're saying our supernatural God, he's like 90-something% at preserving his word through the ages. To me, that's not a very strong argument.
So the way that Wes explained it after the fact, or the way that people ran cover for him, William Lane Craig did a video, and Gavin Ortlid also did a video saying, listen, Wes wasn't trying to claim that it was a miracle. He's not saying the text was preserved miraculously. He's just saying, look, they did a good job preserving the text. You can have confidence that the text is pretty close. And nitpicking about, a few percentages or like a few variants. It's missing the point of what he's saying. But I don't think that's true. Maybe that's what Wes meant, but I don't think that's what Joe Rogan got out of it.
Right.
I think what Joe Rogan got out of it is like, this is a miracle.
Absolutely. Everything with Joe Rogan is whatever is sensational.
A week after this episode, he said, I can't stop thinking about. Wes Huff was on here the other day, and he told me about the Isaiah scroll. It was 1,000 years older, and it was word for word identical. Said it to another guest on the show. That's what Joe Rogan took out of it. So again, like, this is why apologetics is so frustrating, because it's like, maybe you're not explicitly saying something misleading, but you're giving the impression. You're being
too kind, Ben. You're being far too kind.
I mean, maybe.
He's being misleading.
Yeah.
He knew earlier that the way to get Joe Rogan's attention about the Dead Sea Scrolls is to say, and there's a treasure map in it, Joe. Yeah. There's a treasure map. You can go. And Joe's like, really? Did anyone find the gold yet? And now he does the same thing. Like 1,000 years later, it's word for word identical. And immediately Joe Rogan's eyes got all big. And then later, Wes has to come back and be like, well, technically that's not actually true. But haha. And you're absolutely right. It's misleading. And again, it goes to our overriding point about all of this is his actual endeavor here is not to do real scholarship. I can take the Dead Sea Scrolls and make the exact opposite argument. I can say the Dead Sea Scrolls actually give strong evidence against the idea that the Bible has been perfectly preserved or that it represents a single divine revelation. The manuscripts predate the earliest complete copies of the Hebrew Bible by nearly 1,000 years, reveal significant textual variations, competing versions, and even books that were later excluded from the canon. If the Bible was truly preserved by an all-powerful God, wouldn't we expect consistency? The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that key biblical books existed in multiple versions with differences in wording, order, and content. Jeremiah appears in both a shorter and longer version. Isaiah contains extra words and alternate readings. Wait a second, he just said it was word for word. But no, actually, there's different wording, alternate readings, and they differ from the Masoretic text. Some biblical books like Psalms have additional or missing sections. And it shows that scribes were not merely copying, but also editing and altering the text. The discovery of the non-canonical books like Enoch and Jubilees is sitting right next to the biblical text. And that shows us that what we now call scripture was fluid and it was debated. It wasn't just some fixed, universally accepted collection. And again, if God's word was meant to be perfectly preserved, why do we need to see evidence of scribes correcting and modifying and even like reinterpreting passages? So I could make the exact argument and say, no, the Dead Sea Scrolls actually undermine the claim that the Bible is a single, unchanging divine message.
Yeah, there was this weird argument from some of the apologists that the actual variants don't count either. Oh, well, we can see that the scribe just, his eye went up to the line above where the same word was, and he repeated that line again. So that doesn't really count as a variant. But it does count as a variant. Just because you can figure out what the scribe did, because you have both copies, it's still a variant on the text.
And again, there's cases that are absolutely not understood. Where you can't use that argument. That's why it goes from like 92 to 95 or whatever just for Isaiah. Again, they're putting their best foot forward here because if you dig into books like Jeremiah, you have much bigger problems, even Psalms. So it's just frustrating because it actually is a fascinating thing studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have the complete Dead Sea Scrolls book and I've read through it. It's fascinating. I like the history of it. I like understanding it. But then it kind of ruins it for me when people attach these dumb supernatural claims that scholars don't think this. They don't look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and think that there's some kind of miracle that happened here in the preservation of it. They'll just note where the transmission has been accurate and where it's been inaccurate, and then you move on. He's the one that's taking the evidence that we have and totally spinning it in favor of his faith-based commitment.
Even people like James White, they criticize Bart Ehrman's criticism of lack of preservation of the text by saying, like, well, what does he want God to do? Control the hand of every scribe that's copying every copy? But there is no good theology on, like, the instrumentality of how these texts, if you believe in inerrancy, or if you believe in some sort of a supernatural preservation of the text throughout these copying processes, I don't know how it works instrumentally. Like, I don't know, like, if God controls what the scribes write down. But it seems like if that's the case, then this is evidence that that's not true.
I mean, does God want us to go out and pick up venomous snakes or not? I think that's important. And if it's not important to you, well, it's important to the Appalachian snake handlers, right? And it's debated whether it was in the original text. I say debated, it's pretty much established that it wasn't. But many Christians believe that it was original. So these things are important. And again, if you're saying this was preserved by God so that we have his actual words, well, how come some Christians think that's his word and other Christians think that's not his word, and it's in the Bible to this day? So again, they're trying to make the claim that this is evidence of the supernatural, this is evidence of God, yet in their own community, Christians can't even agree on what actually is the word of God and what is not the word of God. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think Joe Rogan just doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to gauge any of these claims at all. You know, if somebody came in and they were like, the mafia and aliens killed JFK, he'd be like, whoa. So it's just the same reaction to, like, everything. Like, he doesn't have, like, the critical apparatus to be able to say, and definitely doesn't have the knowledge of even the basics of the Dead Sea Scrolls or biblical texts. I feel like I want to give Wes credit. I want to treat him like a good faith partner. I wish he would have done more to make sure when you go on a platform that's known for disinformation that you're giving good information.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like you're just throwing fuel on the fire for these morons.
Yeah, it's just like there's so much shit there. Don't just correct the shit with more shit.
Let me go off on a little tangent for a second. It's like the History Channel. When I was very young, the History Channel was World War II documentaries all day long. And they were boring, but it was actual information about real history. And at some point along the way, the History Channel and the Science Channel and all these other cable, I think it's owned by Discovery, they all decided, hey, we want to make money. And in order to make money, they realized that aliens and mermaids and vampires sell a lot more and get a lot more views than actual history. And I think that's what we're seeing in America, and that's what we're seeing with Joe Rogan and the internet in general. People are much more interested in a narrative that serves their biases and sexy conspiratorial information. It's a lot more interesting to believe that Bill Gates is secretly implanting microchips in vaccines to track us all than it is to believe that no, vaccines just help prevent the spread of disease. That's boring. And it's really frustrating living in this America right now for me. And I like to think that there's other people that agree with me on this, but it seems like there's less and less. You know, me and you are becoming the minority. This is, I think, the reason me and you are doing this Joe Rogan interview is we've seen this type of bullshit, you know, coming out of these giant media organizations, and we're trying to throw some water on that fire. And obviously we're going to fail miserably because there's no way our little show is ever going to compete with something like Joe Rogan, because we're in here talking about actual facts and academic research and like, well, what can be verified and what can't be verified. That stuff just doesn't sell to the masses. It's just incredibly frustrating watching the dumbification of society where they want to defund schools and they basically mock academia. And I could go on all day about this, but it's just incredibly frustrating watching really fascinating topics like biblical history being discussed by total morons on the largest scale possible. When you have really intelligent people that they could have on to talk about this stuff, no, apparently what America wants is buffoons and people that have no degree That's who they want on there talking about these things, because then they can talk about treasure maps and the fact that Isaiah was perfectly word for word transmitted over 1,000 years because it's sexy and it brings in viewers. But none of that shit is true. And I think that should matter.
Yeah, I agree. There's, on the one hand, podcasts, long form interviews, and pseudo intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, or even the pseudo history that's on Joe Rogan. Like, there is a hunger that people have to understand things like ancient history or mysteries that they see around them. People are actually interested, but then there's like no clear outlets. They also hate the colleges that would teach them the real answers to those issues. So it's very confusing.
Yeah.
Is that papyrus?
Yes. No, I think that one is vellum.
What is vellum?
So I should be more specific. So parchment is animal skin. Vellum can be used synonymously with the term parchment. Technically, parchment is like baby animal skin, like calves or lambs. But this is the Great Isaiah Scroll.
I feel like Wes kind of flubbed that part a little bit.
I don't know enough about it to...
I don't really know the difference between vellum and papyri, animal skin, but I feel like he was a little bit unclear. He was like, it's animal skin, and vellum is similar to papyrus because it's baby animal skin.
I just looked it up. Basically, did he say that the Isaiah scroll was written on vellum?
I think that he thinks it's vellum. I don't remember if he said that or
Yeah,
not.
I think he said, no, it's written on vellum. It's not. It's written on parchment. And then the difference is they're both animal skin. Parchment is usually sheep, goat, or cow. Vellum is considered a higher quality, and it's usually made from calf skin, and it's finer, smoother, and more durable. But it's distinctively different. You wouldn't call parchment vellum.
Yeah, see, I mean, that stuff is interesting. I would have loved for Wes to talk about that more. And
Well, it didn't sound like he knew that much
that's
about
what I
it.
mean.
Yeah.
But it's weird because that's like what he does. Like, eventually you'll see he gives a recreation of papyri to Joe Rogan. So
I'm just saying, if he's putting himself out there like he's this unbelievably knowledgeable because he's steeped in it, like, well, he should have known that. Like, a real Dead Sea Scroll scholar would know that instantly.
yeah, that's fair. You're starting to convince me Wes Huff's a jerk.
God, it's so beautiful. The way they wrote back then was so beautiful. I mean, maybe it's because I can't read it, that it's so fat. Maybe if I saw English, I would think that's beautiful too.
Like, if you're studying ancient languages and you start to study Greek, like the Greek alphabet is similar enough that you're like, okay, alpha looks like an A, right? Delta looks like a D. So you can figure it out. But Hebrew is completely the opposite because the writing system is so different. The learning curve is hard at the beginning, and then you're like, everything is just 3 letters with a suffix added to it. Whereas the opposite is true with Greek. Greek, you're like, I get this. And then when you really go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh, crap. None of the things that I learned about that are supposed to be standard, all of them have exceptions.
Wow.
But, yeah, cuneiform's a wild one.
Do you know who Rick Strassman is?
No.
He's a scholar, and he did a lot of early work, FDA-approved work on psychedelics.
A scholar of psychedelics.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
And he spent 16 years teaching himself to read ancient Hebrew.
Nice.
Yeah, so because he wanted to really understand the Bible from the original source of ancient Hebrew and to understand it in context.
A lot of people learn Hebrew. A lot of biblical scholars learn Hebrew. He's basically saying there's this guy who's a scholar of psychedelics. You know what he did? He actually learned Hebrew. Like, yeah, that's not like an uncommon thing.
Yeah, I think that yeah, it's just confusing. Like I remember Naomi Wolf was reading the Bible in Hebrew, and she tweeted something about how people need to realize that when it says God in the Bible, it really means gods or something. And like every biblical scholar started dunking on her about how stupid she was. On one hand, she's right, but the other hand, it's still good to have an expert that actually knows how the language is working. You could teach yourself Hebrew and still not be really getting what the original text is telling you, because there's also other things involved besides just knowing the language.
Absolutely.
So different than English, and that something must be lost in translation. So he spent 16 years teaching himself how to read ancient Hebrew. Yeah. That is that is such dedication. 16 years.
It's a long time. That seems too long.
Well, you're self-taught.
When I started learning it formally, I realized how much you miss when you self-teach yourself.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, how many people can teach you ancient Hebrew? How many courses are available?
Oh, you can take it at any graduate college.
Yeah. And is it, it's not something...
That is like the funniest part. Because Joe Rogan is acting like the fact that this one dude, it's because he's the only exposure he has. Yeah. He knew one dude that learned Hebrew, and to him, that he's probably the only person in the world that's ever done that. And then Wes Huff is like, well, no, any university you can actually
go on YouTube right now and learn it.
And then Joe was like, oh, okay.
I don't think that Joe Rogan is that amazing of an interviewer either. This is so sort of like stream of consciousness.
It's all like, oh, the characters are so beautiful and the lettering is so beautiful. Oh, and I knew this guy. Like, you ever hear this guy? Yeah, he was a PhD in psychedelics, and he learned Hebrew. It took him 16 years. Isn't that amazing?
Thought something in the oral tradition was getting lost. Yeah, he's basically an idiot.
I mean, this is the big debate with ancient languages.
Right.
Like, arguably, we don't know how any of this was pronounced.
Right.
And on all my videos where I'm like sight translating Greek manuscripts, there's so many comments of modern Greek speakers getting mad at how I'm pronouncing things.
We don't even know what the words sounded like.
Yeah.
We kind of know what they represent, and then we do a literal translation of what they represent. But if you've never heard, no one can speak ancient Sumerian.
Yeah.
If you learn Hebrew, if you know how to speak Hebrew, and if you go to near where I live in Brooklyn and talk to some Orthodox Jews there, they can speak and read Hebrew. And if you can speak and read modern Hebrew, you can recognize much of biblical Hebrew from what I understand. It's different, but it's not unrecognizable. Again, it's not like some earth-shattering thing that this guy learned ancient Hebrew. I don't want to belabor that point. I'm just really pointing out that Joe Rogan is a moron.
Yeah. Like, he doesn't know that anyone knows how to speak these ancient languages.
Yeah,
just because you can't speak ancient Greek like the way that they spoke it doesn't mean we can't read it. We fucking know how to read it. They read it like they read Greek now. Pneuma or phileo or agape or whatever. The point isn't really recreating the sounds that they were making necessarily when they were reading Greek of that time. It's like being able to, and that's not requisite for translating it into like our language, because that's not what's involved in, it's not transliteration.
It's just weird to me
it's
because
translation. It seems like Joe is very confused about basic concepts.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. That the thing that I find interesting is he comes across like things are super fascinating to him, right? Like somebody will say something like, whoa. But if he was that naturally curious of a person, he would know some of this stuff already. Like if it was so fascinating to him that this guy learned Hebrew when he talked to him months ago or years ago, by now he would have realized that that wasn't quite the amazing thing that he thought it was. That there are lots of people that know and learn ancient Hebrew and lots of modern Hebrew speakers around right now that can actually largely read ancient Hebrew because it hasn't evolved enough so that it's unrecognizable. But it makes me wonder, if he's so fascinated with this stuff, why doesn't he spend some time researching it on less than just a totally surface level? Everything he says is very, very surface level. He has just an instant curiosity about it, and then he doesn't dig any further beneath the surface. That's the impression I get from him anyway.
I think that that's the same criticism that Sam Cedar has leveled towards him, like when it comes to other things. Like he just, he hears something online or sees an article it shapes his worldview in some sort of really powerful way, but he doesn't ever take the time to like fact check it or read the whole article.
I think it's a symptom of, like, I'm sorry to say, but modern conservatives. I won't say their names, but people in my life who I know will text me things that are stupid, or they're like memes. And to them, it's some kind of super insightful thing. And then I'll try to give some background about what I know about that, and it's like in one ear and out the other. It doesn't stick, and the thing that was really powerful was just that meme. It's really frustrating because I think that people don't know how to garner information. They don't know how to fact check things and use critical thinking skills to understand which sources are acceptable and usable and good and which sources are not. It's just frustrating. And I think the reason I keep talking about this stuff is, to me, Joe Rogan epitomizes all of that. It's a good example of what I think is wrong with this country in many ways.
Yeah, and I think it would be fine for Joe Rogan to have this podcast for UFC fans and stuff, like you said before. But the thing that's troubling is that it's the biggest podcast in the country.
Right.
So a lot of people are listening to this, and this is maybe where they're getting their information. And I don't know what the solution is either. I think it's part of a larger crisis of meaning that's going on in our society, where just people don't trust the media anymore. People don't trust the traditional places maybe they would turn to for information. And so, but the memification of our society is, memes are interesting sometimes, but they're also extremely simplistic. And that can be a big problem sometimes. The world doesn't operate in those really simple...
Yeah, and you should dig into it further. Don't just look at things on the surface level. We've talked a lot in this episode about biases. We all have biases, but when something seems to be speaking to the thing you already believe is true, try to be even more critical of that. Be more skeptical of the thing you already believe so that you can research it further. Someone tells you something from a different perspective. If you don't know about it, if you don't have any information about it, don't just write it off and say that's wrong. Research it, and again, go to valued sources, people that have credentials. We talked about vaccines before. If we're talking about vaccines, don't go to Joe Rogan or Bill Maher. They don't know what they're talking about.
It's a language isolate. So Hebrew is an Afro-Semitic language. So Hebrew is related to all of these other languages like Aramaic and Akkadian, but language isolates have no adjacent comparisons.
Whoa.
So,
Right.
So Sumeriologists are a field of their own because I had studied Semitic languages, and there's enough crossover between things like Hebrew and Aramaic and Akkadian, but Sumerian you have nothing to compare it to. But there are a number of ancient languages that are language isolates, like Linear Elamite. We had no idea what Linear Elamite even said until 2021. There's a silver cup, which we had no idea what it said, and then a bunch of researchers, ancient Near Eastern researchers, so that's Linear Elamite. And so that's in and around the same time that languages like Sumerian. So there's this very interesting kind of, if we're talking about the story in the Bible like the Tower of Babel, where it says that God confused their languages, and everybody started speaking different languages, you have these languages that just pop up and out of nowhere and have no relation to one another.
Wait a second. Is he saying the Tower of Babel story is a literal historical event?
So I don't think that he can explicitly make that claim, but he implied that there is a time around when we think the Tower of Babel story would have happened, which I don't know what date that would possibly be in Wes's mind, where these languages arise that don't have any like corresponding links to each other. Now, I didn't read any linguist about this, but I'm extremely skeptical of this claim, and I don't know how would he even know that.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that he's wrong about that, about everything he just said. But I'm no expert. Let's fact check it and we'll come back to it. But he's not a linguist, again.
Yeah.
So it's like now he's just an expert in everything. He just comes on and Bart Ehrman. We always come back to Bart Ehrman because he's the most accessible New Testament scholar. He's widely known, widely read. He's been on TV shows like The Daily Show. And when he's in a discussion like this, if someone starts talking to him about the Old Testament, he'll say, this is what I know about it, but I'm not really an expert in that area. And this guy's not doing that. This guy apparently is an expert in everything. And it's kind of frustrating. But I took that to mean the Tower of Babel really happened.
Yeah. I mean, one thing we know for sure is that the Tower of Babel did not actually happen.
Yeah, I'm taking that as a given and pointing out that, like, this is insane.
So if that is what he's saying, he's wrong about that. Like, we'll actually stake our reputation.
And just in case anyone out there is not that familiar with the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel is a story where God was worried because human beings were able to build towers so tall that those towers were going to come up and actually reach heaven, and the people were going to be able to get into the realm of where God lives. So he decided to miraculously confuse their languages, and that's why we all have different languages spread all over the world. That's what the story says very specifically. God was worried that man was going to do that.
It's a myth explaining why there's different languages. And also using imagery of the ziggurats of that were probably like within the memory of the time of the writing of the story. The representations of what they thought the tower was like. It's clearly a mythological tale.
It's called teleology, right? Where it's a myth that is designed to explain a phenomenon that they didn't really have an answer for. Right. So it would be like if you said, when you hear rolling thunder, oh, well, God and the angels are bowling in heaven. And that's like a myth that's created to explain why we hear that rumbling sound.
You're like, why do I hate snakes and they also bite me on my ankle? Oh, and why do they crawl on the ground? I guess they must have tricked someone to eat fruit.
Or by the Dead Sea, why are there all these pillars of salt? Oh, well, God was turning people into pillars of salt. That's why.
Or why do you have pain during childbirth? Because you sinned in the garden. So it's not a historical event, and I don't think any critical Bible scholars would say that it goes back to a historical event. But again, we'll have to check. But I'm extremely skeptical of this claim about this like explosion of languages.
It reminds me of the argument that intelligent design people use, like the Cambrian explosion. It's the same type of thing. First of all, it wouldn't be shocking to me at all if there was a time in human history where there was an explosion of new languages. That just seems like something that can happen depending on how societies and cultures, diverge, and events that can happen and make that more or less likely. But I'm highly dubious about anything he's saying on this subject, again, because we haven't set up any sort of expertise that he has. So for me right now, he's just this guy. So maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. I'm just skeptical of everything he says because I know that he is not an expert. And I also know certain things that I do know about, and he's given misleading or outright false information so far on it. So I'm not just going to take him at his word. Let's leave it like that.
I mean, maybe he's Noam fucking Chomsky, but until he shows me his degree, he's no linguist. We do actually understand how language acquisition works scientifically, and that human beings have basically the hardware in order to be able to create language. So I don't think languages have to be dependent on each other the same way, even the same way like an evolutionary feature would have to be dependent on each other. I don't think they have to arise from another similar language. I don't think that proves the Tower of Babel. I think that's just human beings are adaptable when it comes to like different sounds to communicate.
Right.
But when you're looking at the words that carry over, it's not because there's a relationship between Akkadian and Sumerian. It's because you have these cultures that live side by side, and eventually Akkadian starts to adopt these things. But Sumerian is... So that's why when I see people like Billy Carson talk about being able to read Sumerian, I'm like, dude, I read ancient languages, and I can't... I've tried, and I can't make heads or tails of Sumerian.
Yeah,
so...
That's a tell.
I think he's talking about loan words, right? Like words that are shared between two ethnic groups that are living next to each other.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I was kind of lost on that part too.
Because one of the big things that people say as evidence for the Exodus is the use of Egyptian words in the text, like Moses is an Egyptian name, and there's like a bunch of other Egyptian terms that come up through the narrative of the wilderness and the Exodus. But if Egypt is a hegemonic power at that time, and it's right next to Canaan, it's like hegemony.
Okay, I don't know.
Like Egypt controls the area, not necessarily as a empire, but just sometimes they have looser control, but not necessarily control by force, but control at some level over this widespread area. It would make sense that some of their words are getting borrowed by Canaanite tribes, even if they didn't exodus from Egypt, right?
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to...
It's interesting that to that point, the Ark of the Covenant is described in a way that is very reminiscent of Egyptian artifacts that we currently have. You can find golden arks in the museum in the Egyptian, and even the dimensions of the tabernacle, I believe, is very similar to Egyptian temples.
And the seraphim story in the desert where the snakes come and bite the Israelites and they have to look on the sacred object, he holds up the snake. That's all, if you look at old Egyptian head garb, it's always the cobra with wings, in the middle. So, there is, obvious influence. So,
yeah,
the Exodus is definitely true.
No, my point is, if God he's describing how the tabernacle should be built, he's describing how the ark should be built, you would think that he wouldn't be influenced by Egyptian art. He would be giving you something so unique that the world has never seen anything since, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know if Wes brings it up. I don't think he brings it up here, but in another episode, I totally agree. It's very clear that when you're looking at the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament also, that there's a cultural context that it's being written in, and it's being influenced by that cultural context. So ancient Near Eastern mythology and ancient Near Eastern concepts of cosmology and older myths are all getting intertwined in the Hebrew Bible, different ways of thinking about the realm of the divine and the realm of the human. In the New Testament, you have more of a Greco-Roman influence, obviously, and I think it's silly to pretend that it's not like that. Wes says in another interview, the sign of circumcision, because there are other ancient Near Eastern people that practice circumcision. People say, well, why would God choose a sign like circumcision that's practiced by other ancient Near Eastern tribes? Why wouldn't he have some sort of a special sign?
I think that's a good question.
Wes said, well, he's going to communicate with them in a way that they understand. This is something that they already culturally know what it means, that you're setting yourself apart.
I guess the same thing with sacrifice.
Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, all of that, all of it. I mean, it all makes sense in the cultural context, but then it's so what is divine about it?
Right.
What can't just be explained by... It's just another ancient Near Eastern religion that, has its own modifications, obviously. There are certain ethical things that are definite innovations in the Israelite religion.
Yes.
And there's a way that it creates its own identity contra to the surrounding ancient Near Eastern culture. At the same time, it's just another ancient Near Eastern religion, and the best way to understand it is to understand it in that context.
I actually think that is one of the most insightful criticisms against religion or against Christianity, is that exact notion that you would think there would be something that would stand out about it that would be totally unique or innovative if it's coming from an all-powerful being. But no, everything seems to be culturally borrowed. Like I was just saying with sacrifices. Sacrifices are done in almost every ancient religion going all the way back to the beginning of human history, let's say. And you would think that the actual God wouldn't really care about slaughtering a baby goat and having its blood spilled out. But no, the Hebrew God does want that, and he's delighted by it, and the burnt offering is pleasing to his sense of smell. That's the same as many other gods from the same region and all around the world. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense to you, but to me that it seems to cut against the idea of the uniqueness of Christianity.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I read through a book that had a lot of Greco-Roman and other texts that are contemporaneous with the New Testament, Gospels, and Christianity has a response built in where they just say these things are all shadows. Man has an understanding of God, and so he's trying to get to God, and these are just imperfect ways that he's trying to do it. That's why there's similarities, right?
That's just a
yeah,
convenient
it
answer.
is. You would think that if there's a true God, that he would differentiate himself or herself in some way that sets it apart.
Yes.
Where it doesn't require, especially you and I talk about this all the time too. It's a 2,000-year-old religion, so it has an ancient concept. Everything about it is just constructed to a different world than the world that we live in now.
Yeah, it's speaking to a different. Some of the things don't even make sense.
No, they're
in our
like
context.
what may have seemed like wondrous at one point in time just seems brutal and unjust, and things need to be understood in their historical context. These ideas don't even develop out of nowhere, so they develop in a historical context too. Circumcision, sacrifice was developed in a context of you wanted your crops to grow, so you'd give your best crops, or you wanted to have healthy children, so you sacrificed your first child. These conceptions of the world are just not the conceptions that we operate under anymore.
Yeah, even scientifically, we talked about doing an episode on the ascension of Jesus, which is a topic I'm really interested in. I'll just say a little bit about it. They believed that the earth was flat, and God was on a throne sitting above the earth, above the firmament, which was a dome over the earth. And we think of that in the Old Testament when it's talking about Genesis and Noah's Ark and the flood and all that. But even in the New Testament, Jesus ascended to heaven. So the idea is that Jesus ascended to his Father up in the sky. Now, if you ask a Christian, where did Jesus go when he ascended up into heaven? What answers do you get? I actually have done this recently to find out the answer, and I've gotten a few different answers. I think the most common answer you get is, well, he went up into the sky and then disappeared into another heavenly dimension. And heaven is not somewhere you can fly to in the universe. And then the question becomes, what was the point of flying up into the sky at all then? Like, couldn't have he just disappeared on Earth? The flying up in the sky really makes sense in context of the Bible when you read it, when every time you need to talk to God, you would have to go up on a high mountain, or you would have to ascend in a chariot of fire, or God would have to come down to you on a ladder, like Jacob's ladder. I mean, it was literally, God was up in the sky. The Tower of Babel, God was worried that they were going to actually reach him in the sky. So it makes total sense that Jesus is ascending back up into heaven. But now, with what we understand about the universe, no Christian, except for flat earthers, and maybe they're being more consistent, but most Christians don't believe that. They believe that the earth is a ball revolving around the sun. In which case, it's a hard question of like, where did Jesus go when he ascended into heaven? Like, it's a good example of how the Bible really only makes sense in the context of the way the people at that time understood the world to be. And now we can look at it from a different perspective and realize, hey, a lot of those things they were wrong about.
I really enjoy talking to him. I really do. I think his videos are fun. But I also think truth is important.
Ben, truth is important.
I
Joe
know.
Rogan thinks truth is important.
I know, it's so funny. Again, it's just so ironic. Joe Rogan platformed Billy Carson, so it's not like, oh, he's a fun little switch from the normal stuff that we do around here. Real history. It's like, no, dude, all you do is spread misinformation.
Yeah.
And recognize what you know and what you don't know, and that you're not doing people a service, especially people like myself that aren't educated in this. Like, we turn to others who claim to have a vast knowledge of this to help me out. Tell me what's going on. When I sit down and talk to you, tell me what's going on. And if you don't really know, you're fucking over a lot of people, unfortunately, for yourself.
It's so ironic.
It's also like, what Billy Carson does is sort of like what the apologists do. He's not just out there criticizing Christianity. He has his own sort of new agey, alien-centric religion that he preaches. So Joe is making this criticism of Billy Carson, but I think, again, the same criticism could easily be made of the apologists, who they're not just coming in to tell you about the texts or about the history. They have also an agenda to get you to agree with their ideology.
Yeah.
Linear Elamite. Yeah, that guy.
Look at that dude's honker.
He's got a big nose, isn't it?
That's a hell of a nose.
Yeah, he can smell that linear Elamite. So there's an infographic that I made that just popped up. If you go to wesleyhuff.com, I started making these things for the graduate students I was teaching. And so if you go down, there should be an archaeology section. I make ones for manuscripts too.
What a great website.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
This is awesome. It's so detailed. What a fucking phenomenal resource this is.
You see that, so I have Sumerian, Linear, Elamite, Akkadian, and Paleo-Hebrew there at the bottom, the comparisons. And these are languages that operated like alongside one another, but are almost completely foreign to one another. So there is crossover between Akkadian and Paleo-Hebrew.
So that's interesting. Sumerian, when I'm thinking of cuneiform, I'm not thinking of that, right? That looks different than some of like the clay scrolls, where they've, the imprintations that they make with a clay wheel.
Yeah, well, it's all done with the stylus. So it's like a little wedge stylus. Akkadian basically borrowed the writing system. And it had development over time, but is very close.
So when they conquered them, did they have their own writing system initially and just incorporated Sumerian writing to theirs?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
But God, I'd like to know.
I know, right?
I mean, it's so long ago, but not,
Again, they're so far astream from what Wes even is his main field of expertise, or whatever you want to call it, which is fine. I mean, that's sort of the way Joe Rogan's show goes. But I think you used the example of Bart Ehrman before. Like, if you talk to a historian about the Crusades and then all of a sudden started talking about the Vietnam War, that historian wouldn't just start acting like he also knew about the Vietnam War. It's like, this is just a weird way to do history, I think.
When you think, like, we went from 4,000 years ago to that to large language models.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, quantum computing.
Yeah, well, even if you look at language systems develop. Paleo-Hebrew turns into what we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls, whereas Paleo-Hebrew is a little bit different than what we eventually see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there's like a development within the language. And then modern Hebrew adopts the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but modern Hebrew has... it has vowels that were developed in the Middle Ages to figure out how to pronounce it. Because basically, ancient Hebrew doesn't have a vowel system in its writing that's overly comprehensive. And so in the Middle Ages, when you have these groups of Jews who are copying these Hebrew scriptures, who aren't speaking it as much as they're reading it. You got to figure out how to pronounce it because vowels make a difference. But if you took all the vowels out of English, if you're a natural English reader, you could probably figure out what was what if you're looking at the page. And so in the Middle Ages, the Masoretic scribes come up with these vowel pointing systems, and that's what you see when you look at a Hebrew Bible today, is you see these vowels. And sometimes the introduction or removal of the vowel is significant in the changing of the words.
It's also interesting, and we're kind of seeing language change, written language, while right now in this current era because of the we've kind of abandoned cursive.
It would be interesting to talk sometime about the way the various changes that happened through the Paleo-Hebrew and the vowels being added to the Hebrew. Because that seems like it has potential to be the cause of much greater variations in meaning than even scribal errors.
Right.
Because you're totally relying on the subjective interpretation of the scribe who's doing the copying to figure out where the vowels go.
Most classes don't teach cursive. We all learned cursive as children. Computers became ubiquitous, it's gone.
Yeah.
And everybody's just texting.
Yeah. Well, let's hope people in the future are still able to read the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Because that's...
So, if you've ever read any old... This is totally... I'm doing the same thing I just criticized them for, but if you ever read any old documents from colonial America, the way that they do the letters actually is very different. The way they do F's look like S's.
Right.
So, even if they still know cursive, they may have trouble with the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I'm just kind of waiting for something more interesting.
You didn't think the F's as S's was interesting enough to jump in on?
No, what you're saying is interesting. It's just what they're saying is kind of I don't see where he's going with it.
Yeah, this is sort of... I think this is actually kind of interesting, but it's a little bit out of the...
Again, I would find it interesting coming from, an expert.
Yeah, fair enough. The thing that's funny is that Wes is studying textual tradition and scribal culture, I think is one of the things that is his main concentration. But he's not studying Hebrew Bible scribes. He's studying scribes in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century CE.
Right.
So Christian scribes. So he's not studying even early Christian scribe or the first few levels of transmission. He's an expert in the scribal practices that happen in the Middle Ages and stuff.
Yeah. Language models are wild.
Wild.
Yeah.
The whole thing is wild, that people figured out how to associate sounds with little symbols, and then they did completely different shit in Korea, with completely different shit in Russia.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating.
It's funny to me just to hear Joe Rogan, again, for the first time, get interested in a subject that's been around forever, like linguistics. If you're really interested in it, he says, it's so fascinating, it's so wild, and I've spent zero time in my life even thinking about it, because now when I hear about it, it blows my mind. It's like what we were saying before. There's a whole field of study here. If you're really interested in it, you could go down that road, and then you would know a lot more about it than you obviously know now.
And for him, it would be easier than it would be even... He doesn't even necessarily have to do the work. He could just say, get me someone on my show that knows about this shit, that's an expert. Get me, call Cambridge or Oxford.
Right.
And get me, the best person in the world to talk about this stuff. I want to be able to grill them about
and they would definitely do it.
Every question I have. And it's it's the biggest podcast in the world. Of course we'll come on. Or they'll send somebody else or recommend somebody else good to come on. But instead, I'll have Russell Brand on to talk about this shit.
Right.
It doesn't really make sense. If I wanted to learn about this, I would have to read a bunch of books or watch a bunch of scholarly lectures. But Joe Rogan could literally just have someone come on and they would answer every question that he had. And
right.
he could know as much as he wants to know about it.
I'm torn between thinking that Joe Rogan is actually interested in this stuff and thinking that he's just phoning it in here. Because some of the time it sounds like he's just like, whoa, as if it's kind of like not really genuine. I don't know. And if it was genuine, I would feel like he would know a little bit more than he knows. Because if you're genuinely curious, you would naturally have paid attention to this stuff throughout your life.
Yeah. It's hard to know what he's... Like, it doesn't seem disingenuous to me, but I think you're right that real curiosity, you can't really stop until you're really trying to get answers to the questions. And like when I get curious about something, it usually entails a few days of frantic research and, you know, like trying to find some basic answer to the question that I came up with. And that's just sort of the way my mind works. And I think all of those questions will stay in my brain forever, and I'm constantly kind of still thinking about them. Yeah, I agree with you. It's too bad that he doesn't take more of an inquisitive route to actually not only educate himself, but like have that opportunity to educate his audience.
Yeah.
These experts who can translate these things, and you're dependent upon them forever, which that was what Lutheranism was all about, right? Like Martin Luther wanted to have phonetic translations of the Bible, and there was a lot of resistance to that because the people that knew how to read Latin were like, hey, slow down.
Yeah, partly. I mean, there were proto-reformers before Luther.
Were
You know,
there
guys
really?
like Wycliffe. So John Wycliffe and William Tyndale both translated the Bible, parts of the Bible into English, and they predated. I mean, and they weren't very popular for it either. I mean, Wycliffe was declared a heretic, and then his body was exhumed and burned because of the work that he did. But yeah,
Burned him after he was already dead.
Yeah, well, Tyndale's line was that he wanted, I believe it was Tyndale. It was either Wycliffe or Tyndale. My friends who are specialists in this are going to get mad at me for this. But one of those two guys said that they wanted the plowboy to be able to read the Bible and know it as well as the priests. And so that was their motivation, is that they're like, you know, public education for literacy in these areas was largely because they just wanted people to read the Bible. But
I just feel like that was super confusing. He doesn't really answer Joe's question. Again, like Wesley Huff is not an expert in the Reformation, so trying to show a little bit of grace. But he brings up Wycliffe being burned after he's dead, and Joe says, after he's dead, and then he goes right into Tyndale,
Right.
and what Tyndale says about people being able to read the text. But people couldn't really read the text because it wasn't wide literacy at that time. And then he talks about public education as a way to educate people to read the Bible, which, again, I think is somewhat true. I mean, not public education, but I think like there was education that was instituted so that people would be able to read the scriptures. Were used as a key text in teaching people how to read. I think that the reformers were trying to get the Bible into the language of the people. All that stuff is true in the most vague sense, but again, he's bringing up all this stuff and not really giving any clarity, and then not even really addressing. It's just like when you get yourself involved in stuff that you don't actually know about. And then the other thing is, I thought Wyclef Jean was a guy from the Fugees. That was just a little joke at the end.
that was a big motivation behind Luther, was he's like, I'm going to translate this thing to German. Because part of his kind of kicking off of the what we call the Protestant Reformation was that he read the Bible in Greek, because there was a guy named Desiderius Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus is like one of the last true Renaissance men. But he was compiling, and he produced the first printed edition of the Greek New Testament. And so he comes out with this printed edition of the Greek New Testament, and Luther gets his hands on it. And so he's reading that, and he notices that in Matthew's Gospel, the word that's in the Latin is penitentiam agite, do penance. In Greek is metanoiete, which is repentance. And the church was using this as like, you need to do penance. You need to, do all of this stuff to show that you're sorry. And part of that was, paying the church. And Luther reads this and he goes, hey, guys, this means something different. This means repentance. It means changing your mind. It doesn't mean like to actually do things. And so part of his motivation is like the Latin isn't reflecting, at least at the point that Latin had developed in that day. Like maybe when Jerome translates the Latin Vulgate back in the 4th century, and it's called the Vulgate because Vulgata means like regular. Like if you think of vulgar, right? It's just the regular people language. Part of the reason was that in the 4th century, very few people were reading Greek. They were reading Latin. And so they're like, hey, Jerome, you need to produce a Bible in Latin because nobody can read the Bible anymore. And so he produces the Latin Vulgate. And ironically, by the time you get to Luther, 1,000 years later, no one can read Latin. And they're all using the Vulgate.
Wow, that is fascinating.
So, again, I thought it was confusing. I think he's just misspeaking sometimes, too. He just said they can't read Latin, so they're using the Vulgate by the time of the Reformers, whereas he probably means that they can read Latin, but they're trying to go back to the Greek to test it against the Greek. And also, I think it's important just to keep in mind that through all this time in history, there's a large portion of the population that is just illiterate, especially in the early centuries. It was a small number of people that these texts would be, that would actually be able to read these texts. Most of the time, these texts would be read out loud, sort of performed. So you would have people hearing them rather than reading them. So that's just something I think is important to keep in mind. And I also think he kind of gets repentance wrong. I think he's right that the Vulgate translation is bad. But I don't think that repentance in Matthew means just changing your mind. I think repentance in Matthew also means changing what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to hear a Catholic scholar come on and see what they think about what he's saying.
Yeah, and I think people tend to, this is just my criticism of the way the Reformation is framed in church parlance, is it kind of divorces it from its historical contingency and the other historical things that were going on at the time. Like Luther was having this revelation where he was seeing, he thought the Bible was teaching one thing, but it was also in reaction to a lot of other things historically that were going on. And then there were also other different historical contingent factors that ended up creating the rifts that caused the Reformation. So it's more historically complex than just Luther had a problem with the Vulgate translation of one word. And because of that translation, condemned the selling of indulgences. Like, it's more like he thought indulgences were a problem for certain reasons and then came to the conclusion about the text.
I think what you're saying, he sounds like an apologist here. He has these prepackaged kind of arguments that are somewhat interesting or compelling, and they're not really as nuanced as reality. And it's a little bit frustrating when he passes himself off as some kind of expert, and then what he's actually giving you is packaged apologetics.
It's like the same history lesson you get in church from your pastor.
Right.
I think that it's...
yes, that's exactly what it's like.
It's incomplete, which, again, it's hard to teach like an in-depth history to people on a Sunday, but people draw conclusions from what they know of the story, and if they don't actually understand the historical significance of events, it just creates issues. We've talked before about the persecution complex of the church and the way that historical misunderstanding leads to misunderstandings of what's going on in the world now.
Right.
Wow.
And even Erasmus was, so he dedicates his first few editions to the Pope because he knows that the Pope is going to get wind that he's producing Greek New Testaments, and the Church is using the Latin, and he's risking his life. So if he dedicates it to the Pope, maybe the Pope will take it easy on him.
Did it work?
Yeah, it did.
Nice, little flattery.
Yeah, see, it goes a long way.
Well, that's part of the problem, right? Is that you're dealing with these priests, you're dealing with human beings. And when human beings are the sole purveyors of truth, that becomes a problem. It's power. It's too much power. Most people suck at power. They're just it just makes them drunk with it, and they abuse it. And you see that in many, many religions. You see that in cults. You know, for instance, is the best example of it, because like when you know the person who created this thing, and you know this person is fucking insane, and you have a bunch of people that follow them,
they're just looking out for your best interest, Joe.
Yeah.
Once you have a leader that's telling you, abandon your family, I'm your family now, this collective replaces your family, you need to be willing to treat your own relatives as if they're your enemies, you need to be ready to die at any time. Yeah, I mean, that's a cult.
Yeah, it's ironic that they don't see the obvious parallels.
Even if you're a Christian, you should recognize that this isn't a common form that religion takes early on. We talk about the apocalyptic expectation in the early Christian texts, especially in Paul and in the synoptics, and they're going to talk about cults a little bit, but it's such an important context to realize that that was the furnace that created Christianity in its early days too.
I'm tempted to go off on a tangent. You started talking about family and how cults operate. And, we've done 3 episodes now about family and what the New Testament says about this. But I was just thinking about it more the other day. I mean, it really is fascinating that the number one thing that a cult leader will do is try to separate you from your loved ones and friends, and family especially. And that is exactly what Jesus in the New Testament is commanding his followers to do. He's basically saying, you can't even follow me at all unless you abandon your family. Now, Christians will debate that. They hear that and they think, I'm crazy for thinking that. But I'm literally just reading the text word for word for what it's saying in the correct context. And it just makes total sense. Christianity, when it started, it was really no different than any cult that is starting up now, and the same techniques were used then. And it makes sense. It's almost like the cult wouldn't even be able to exist if it didn't have rules like that, because there's no way Torah adhering Jews, their family members would go along with somebody like Jesus. A prerequisite to follow him has to be like, you can't listen to those people anymore. It's better if you just completely leave them. And that's exactly what cult leaders do today.
It's just important to be able to actually read those passages in that context, because people will talk about, it's so difficult to really do the things that Christianity teaches. And what they mean by that is like, the culture is telling me to accept LGBTQ people, but I'm going to stand for God's view of gender. And that's not what it's talking about. The hard stuff is give away all your property, alienate yourself from your family, be ready to be crucified, be a slave to Christ. These are things that are actually taught in the Bible that are the hard things that Jesus says.
Yeah, and the example you gave, the Jesus from the New Testament would absolutely accept trans people. He is talking to prostitutes, and people are criticizing him for it, and he doesn't condemn them. So you're absolutely right. The things that actually are hard to do are the things that Christians today are not willing to do, like sell all their property and give everything to the poor, like you just said. Again, We're not telling Christians they need to do this. We're telling them that's what their God is telling them to do if they take the Bible seriously.
Yeah, we're not the ones saying it's better not to have children. That's what the Apostle Paul says.
Right. And we're not telling them to hate their children. That's what Jesus told them.
Right. That the enemies will be the members of your own family and that you need to be eunuchs for the kingdom. That actually comes from Jesus.
Right.
All these cult documentaries, all these exposés, in the beginning, like, these people haven't made. They're all eating together, and they have community, and they're praying together, and they seem
they're just seeking enlightenment.
Happy. Yeah.
They're so
I love
interesting.
them. I love them because there's something about people, like, absolutely believing things that's so appealing to me. I don't know why that is. Like, I like watching Islamic scholars speak, with, like, full confidence that their version of truth is truth.
I mean, he's kind of contradicting what he said before, where he was talking about speaking in confidence but speaking in ignorance. You can talk in total confidence, but if you don't really know what you're talking about...
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Joe Rogan is the ultimate seeker, but in that really, again, kind of wishy-washy way.
That's why I disagree. He tries to put himself out like that.
Yeah.
But I can't think it's actually genuine because he would have found some of this information that he's seeking, because he comes at it as if he's never heard of anything. Like, Joe, people do learn how to read Hebrew in colleges. He's like, whoa.
And how you take a message shouldn't be based on the confidence of the person that's giving you the message. It should be the content of whatever they're telling you. I think that's so basic. I find cult documentaries extremely interesting as well. I mean, I've always been interested in religion, but like the dynamics that I find similar to early Christianity and the history of Christianity. I think when you watch like a documentary on Jim Jones or on David Koresh, you can't help but see those parallels.
Yeah, I mean...
But I'm not like, wow, look at David Koresh. He's speaking so confidently about his interpretation of the scriptures. He must be right.
I'm trying to think of a good analogy for the point I'm trying to make. I think cults are like pilot episodes. A cult is no different than any major religion. It pops up, and it's very unlikely that it will be greenlit and turned into a big hit NBC sitcom. If it does, it becomes a major religion. But there's way more pilots of shows that you never hear about, and those are cults. But there's no different. A cult is just a major religion in its infancy stage. The cults that we really focus on, or that we watch documentaries on, are the ones where the shit hits the fan and it erupts in total violence, or some kind of dramatic ending where everyone commits suicide. But that's not what makes it a cult. In my opinion, evangelical Christianity is no different than a cult. And some churches are more cultish than others. Some have much more slavish devotion to the pastor than other churches do. But I'm sure if anyone spent any time in evangelical churches, you see parallels. Because I know I do. When I watch a cult documentary, I see all kinds of parallels to just the normal evangelical church that I grew up in. For instance, did the pastor in the church that I grew up in tell everybody to shave their head and, commit suicide? No. But here's the thing. If he was corrupted enough to do that, I know for a fact there are people in that church that would have gone along with that. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that is the key to say, yeah, it's cultish. It's not all of them, but you have people that would go along with it, just like the Hail-Bot, quote-unquote, crazy people.
Yeah. Actually, that analogy of a pilot episode is a really good analogy, because sometimes you have even pilots for like a spin-off show. So, a spin-off of Judaism called Christianity. Let's see how it does. And then Christianity spins off into Gnosticism and
Mormonism.
And Mormonism, yeah, exactly. So there used to be an idea of cults being this thing where you could measure the amount of control that they hold over people, and that was the way to judge it. And I don't think that most
people that study cults look at it that way or conceptualize it that way anymore, because of the reason that you're saying. Regular mainstream religion can also exert an extreme amount of control. And even Christianity, like I mentioned it before, the idea is to free you from slavery to the world and make you a slave to Christ. The idea is not that you are finding autonomy, it's that you're willing to be a slave to what Jesus is telling you. And there's nothing more cultish than that idea.
Yeah, and again, I mentioned the Heaven's Gate. That stuff sounds crazy when we hear it. But if you heard the basic tenets of Christianity for the first time, if you had never heard of anything about this before, you would also think it was crazy. You have a ghost that lives inside of you called the Holy Spirit. I could go down a whole litany, and if you had never heard that before, you would be like, yeah, that's some bizarre cultish thing. We need to drink the blood of the Savior. The biggest branch of Christianity, the Catholics, would say you literally are drinking the blood of Jesus and eating his flesh whenever you do your communion. That's all kind of cultish. You're literally walking around with an execution device around your neck in the shape of a cross. That would be similar to walking around with an electric chair around your neck. So again, it doesn't seem crazy to us because we're so used to it and it's so common. But that's the point. Like any cult, it only seems crazy at the beginning, only seems crazy to the people that aren't in it. But it's no different than any religion, in my opinion.
Yeah, the lines are very fuzzy on all these things, like the difference between a cult and a religion, the divide between the two.
Talking about the Mormon Church, they recently did this thing where they're like, you don't need to go on the internet, and you don't need to. And it's
Don't
like,
watch
guys,
the Book of Mormon.
yeah, guys, I don't think you realize what you're sounding like when you come across in that way.
Mormons are the nicest cult members.
We know why they're family oriented, right?
Why?
Is because in what Joseph Smith wrote, there's an idea that everybody's soul pre-exists, and you were born as a spirit child in a previous life. And the reason you need to have children is you need to bring those people's souls into existence. And so there's because you have a heavenly father and a heavenly mother. And you're all children of God in the actual physical sense. And that the pursuit is exaltation, where you will be a god on your own planet if you've done everything right.
You get your own planet, which is pretty dope.
Your own planet.
So this sounds, it's so silly to imagine that you become a god and you mate with another woman and repopulate your planet. Okay, that sounds silly, but start explaining Christian theology. Well, Paul says you become like one of the sons of God. Paul basically has you floating up into the ether above the earth. I think you've talked before about the idea of a firmament with Christ sitting on his throne at the top of the firmament. These ideas all seem sort of funny as well.
That's exactly my point. It's no crazier at all than, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. What's the difference? Everyone gets their own planet versus we're going to be on a new planet that we're all going to be together. I just don't. You could go through Christianity and I could make it look ridiculous if I wanted to, with just the basic teachings that they've had from the beginning. I mean, he literally earlier hinted at the Tower of Babel being a true fact of history. So again, it bothers me when Christians do that. It's a very popular thing among evangelicals to point at Mormons and kind of laugh at how ridiculous they are because of the things they believe. What they believe is equally absurd.
And it's like the unfalsifiable stuff that they believe. Oh, you get to be a god on another planet. If you want to talk about the historicity of Joseph Smith finding the tablets or the reasons why the Book of Mormon has scientific problems, if you want to talk about how the Bible doesn't actually reflect what we understand about science, I think that's fair. But I think that there's just a certain amount of ridiculousness that is inherent in every religious belief. So when you argue Mormonism versus Christianity versus Islam, when they start getting into these esoteric beliefs that you can't falsify, like, oh, you believe in God this way and I believe in God this way, so therefore I must be right. Well, it's like you're both wrong for believing in God.
Yeah. I want to go back to what he said about not researching. That struck a chord with me because that's exactly the same mentality that they had for us in church. It was like, well, you can read about this stuff, but only read these books that I'm recommending. Don't read anything from a secular source. And all the evangelical communities and all the friends I had, that was very standard. The standard play was to give that kind of advice to people. So don't act like that's just a symptom of Mormonism and not a part of Christianity. Like, Christianity has a long history of censorship and authoritarianism. So don't act like Christianity's always been super open to new ideas. I think Galileo would be interested in that.
And I think the conception of the world as the playground of the devil, and there's this idea that you can't trust the world, or that the world is inherently against Christ.
Right.
And I think that that's why, like, when I was a kid and went to public school, it was like, pay attention in science class, because they're going to try to teach you a bunch of stuff that's not true, that's going to go against your faith, and you have to be on guard and not just accept, like, what the secular people are telling you. And that shuts down thinking the same way it is to, like, say, don't go on the internet and then look for stuff. Like, it's the same function.
Yeah, also there's just a lot more Christians out there, so there's a lot more Christian content if you do look something up on the internet. Actually, to the point where it's really frustrating when you're trying to get real information. Like, Ben and I are interested in, like, biblical stuff, and if you do Google searches, 90% of what you find on page 1, or maybe 100% of what you find on page 1 of any Google search is, like, coming from a Christian perspective. Often what they're saying goes completely against what academia says. So the actual experts and historians are saying something about a subject, and you can't even find that information without really digging down. So that can be maddening also.
Yeah, these inter-religious debates get very frustrating in my mind.
Yeah,
Catholics
also,
and Protestants want to, like, argue at a certain point. I'm just like, you're never going to agree because you have this fundamental difference when it comes to certain aspects. And it's not entirely clear who is right because you both are just making some sort of a faith claim.
Also, Joe Rogan said something nice about Mormons, and Wes couldn't take it. He had to be like, oh yeah, well, the reason that they're very family oriented is because they believe all this crazy stuff about spirit children. I'm like, well, like I said earlier, I think it says something about your religion when people like Joe Rogan notice that, like, the Christians aren't really very nice, but the Mormons are nice, but the Christians, they're not really very nice people. They're like, it's modern, and obviously I'm speaking incredibly broadly. I happen to know a lot of very nice Christians. But when you think about Christianity in America, evangelical Christianity, it has a stereotype now that I think it's earned of being a bunch of, like, red-hatted lunatics that are on the fringe and that are hateful toward immigrants, hateful toward LGBTQ communities. And I think that reputation is earned, and he's right. The Mormons don't give off that kind of hateful vibe, and I think that's a positive for them. I mean, again, I'm not a Mormon. I don't agree with their ideology. But I'm just saying, if I'm to look at it, like, I think it's interesting that somebody like Joe Rogan sees the same thing that I see, and that these Mormon people are more approachable, they're nicer, and they're easier to get along with. And you can have a conversation with them rather than these, like, flamethrower apologetic evangelicals who always have an argument. They're always combative. And anyway, I could go on, but I think you see my point.
Yeah, I think Christianity wants to have it both ways, kind of, with this. Like, oh, we bring something positive to society, or, like, we've played a positive good in history. But then if, like, you say, like, well, the Mormons seem to make good communities, they're like, who cares about, like, the consequences, like their whole premise is wrong.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, like, what is it? Like, do the consequences, like, show the truth of the premise, or are they just, like, totally detached in a way that, like, saying that they are? So I find that it's strange. Oh, Christianity and Christian belief brings a better society, but Mormons' belief, even if it brings a better society, is still wrong.
Right.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.